literature is an axe to break the frozen sea within. And William Urey's books are little axes to break the frozen sea within and between us. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time telling you about his accomplishments. I think those are going to be quite apparent to all of you who have followed his career. They're staggering. He has contributed in enormous ways to creating a more peaceful world. What I would like to suggest is that he has done something for each and every one of us, and that is that he has passed on the ability to pass on a gift to people who are in conflict. This is my way of thinking of it. You can count the number of seeds in an orange, but you can't count the number of oranges in a seed. And every one of these books contains multiple seeds that we are passing on regularly. In every single day of our work, we use what William Urey has given to us. And for this, we need to be humbly, deeply, profoundly grateful. So it gives me great pleasure to present the Southern California Mediation Association Peacemaker of the Year Award to William Urey.
So it's an enormous pleasure to be with you this morning, and I'm deeply honored by this award given by my old friend Ken Cloak, who's an extraordinary mediator, as you know, and I had the great pleasure of meeting his wife, Joan Goldsmith, even many years before that, enormously talented and a great contributor to the field of leadership. And I, just in my, as I was thinking about how many years that goes back, and I was wondering about how I even got into the field of mediation. I was a graduate student in my second year in anthropology at Harvard, and one cold evening I kind of rented an attic room in someone's house, and one cold Sunday evening I got in the wintertime I got a call, and it was, and you don't usually get calls from professors, and it said, "This is Professor Roger Fisher, and I've read your paper," which I had sent him because I had talked to him about maybe being an anthropologist. I was trying to imagine what I was going to do my thesis on, and I thought, what if you were an anthropologist, like a fly on the wall at a Middle East peace negotiation? What would you see? And I'd sent it to him, and he said yes, and I liked it, and I liked the central table, which talked about how you would tell if a mediation was going well. And he said, and I sent it to the Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East, because I thought he might be interested. And I was wondering if you'd like to come work with me. And so that was actually the beginning of my interest in mediation, because I went on to work with him, and 4 years later, we produced Getting to Yes. But before that, actually, we produced a book called International Mediation, a Working Guide, which was a kind of a guide that we had interviewed international diplomats, international mediators for, and tried to collect their wisdom. And at the time we joked, well, the audience for that book would be very slim. There might be 6 international mediators in the world at that time. So, so I proposed to Roger that we turn that into a more general book for not just mediation, but negotiation, and not just for international, but for everyone. And that actually was the origin of Getting to Yes. And at the time, I was really not just interested in writing about mediation, but also practicing it. I had a thirst for practice, and there was a judge I met who was a small claims court judge who was complaining about his workload. And I said, would you mind if I came and tried to mediate some of your cases to take the workload off of you? And if, of course, it doesn't work, you can, you have the cases. He said, sure. And so I showed up with a colleague from Harvard Law School, and we started mediating cases involving things like rugs that were spoiled in a dry cleaner, or landlord-tenant disputes about the rent. And from there, I looked for work elsewhere because it was hard to get work in international mediation. So I got a job working at a coal mine in Kentucky as a mediator with a friend of mine, Steve Goldberg, and then became an arbitrator in the coal industry. And then eventually started to get some work. I got a opportunity to go to the city of Jerusalem and co-write a book about what if you were trying to mediate the issues, the very contentious issues around the city of Jerusalem. And then eventually went to my true passion at the time, which was seeing if one could negotiate in any way to contribute to reducing the risk of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Anyway, it just went on, and it's been an enormous pleasure for me over the many years wandering around the planet, looking at the toughest situations I can find to see if there are any opportunities for mediation, for negotiation to contribute to those resolutions. And I'd like to share with you, just actually, if I might, three lessons, really, among many that I've learned over these 30 or 40 years of wandering around the planet in different domains, from labor to business to family to wars. Because my passion really is, what got me into mediation was a passion for seeing that, it seemed to me, I think it was Einstein who at the end of World War II and Hiroshima and Nagasaki who said, there's a race that's started now between our human technological genius for devising weapons of incredible destruction and our moral, emotional, cultural, social genius for learning how to live with each other and deal with our deepest differences. And it seems to me we're still in that race. And so that's really what animated me. And so maybe the first lesson, actually, it was interesting to me was, so much about mediation, as you know, is about being a good listener. And to listen to other people, to put yourself in their shoes, to have empathy. One of the things I've found is that actually there's a prior step. If I'm to listen to others, it's not so easy to listen to others, and it's not so easy for our parties to listen to each other, as you know. But what I found is that actually there's a prerequisite to that, which is if we want to listen truly to others, we need to learn to listen to ourselves. If we want to put ourselves in the other side's shoes, we need to learn to really put ourselves truly in our own shoes. If we want to learn to get to yes with others, we need to learn to get to yes with ourselves. What I learned was that actually, because after writing Getting to Yes, I'd say perhaps the most common question I received was, okay, that's fine if both sides want to get to yes, but what if they don't want to get to yes? What if you're dealing with someone who's saying no? What if someone is being obstructive? What if someone who's using dirty tricks? What if someone is just being totally obstinate? They're just totally rigid in their positions. How do you get to yes with someone who doesn't want to get to yes? And so I thought about that, and I went and looked at different situations and practiced it as well. And so I wrote a book called Getting Past No. But over the years, it dawned on me that perhaps the most difficult person we ever have to deal with in a negotiation is not the person on the other side of the table. It's this person right here. It's us. It's the person we look at in the mirror every morning. And I think there's some real truth in that. I'll just give you just one example that was a kind of a dawning moment for a moment. Back about almost 20 years ago, I was asked by President Jimmy Carter to go to the country of Venezuela, which was going through enormous civil turmoil like it is actually right today, very tragically. And half the country was totally polarized. Half the country was strongly supportive of the president, Hugo Chavez, and half the country was strongly opposed to him, and you'd have 1 million people on the streets of Caracas, the capital, demanding the resignation of President Chavez, and you'd have 1 million people supporting him. And there was some violence, and international observers were fearing that this could lead to widespread civil violence, even civil war. And so I went down and I met with people and the parties and so on. And I had a number of meetings with President Chavez himself. And at one of them, I remember, he said the appointment was set for 9 o'clock at night. He'd like to meet at night. I went to the palace with my friend Francisco. And we waited very patiently in the palace there, 9, 9:30, 10, 10:30, 11, midnight. Finally, we're ushered in to see the president, expecting to find him entirely alone at that time of night, but in fact, he had his entire cabinet arrayed behind him. And he said to me, "Okay, so Yuri, so have a seat here. Tell me, what do you think's going on here? What's your sense of things now here in Venezuela?" And I said, "You know, Mr. President, I've been talking to some of your government ministers here. I've been talking to the leaders of the opposition." And I thought I would give it a little positive note. And I said, "And I think, actually, there's a little bit of progress." Well, that apparently was the wrong thing to say, because he didn't want to hear that. He said, "What do you mean, progress? Are you blind? Are you naive? Are you not seeing what's going on?" And he leaned very closely into my face and proceeded to shout at me for approximately 30 minutes, saying, you're not seeing what those traitors on the other side are doing." And he just went on. And of course, I was, you know, if I looked inside myself, I was like feeling, well, oh, a year and a half of work down the drain here, everything, you know, down the drain. I was feeling kind of a little bit embarrassed in front of the entire cabinet being shouted down here. And then I remembered, actually, I had a friend who was from Ecuador, actually, who had said to me sometime, he said, "You know, William, if you're in a tough situation," he said, "remember to pinch the palm of your hand." And I said, "Hernan, why would I do that?" He said, "Because it will give you momentary pain, and that pain will keep you alert." So for whatever reason, I remember that moment to pinch the palm of my hand and just do what I call going to the balcony, which is like imagining that you're on a stage. To me, it's kind of one of the fundamentals of effective negotiation. The ability of imagining yourself on a stage, and part of your mind, your heart, your emotions, goes to a mental and emotional balcony overlooking that stage, a place where you can kind of see the situation with a little more perspective, a place of calm, a place of self-control, a place of stillness, a place of perspective, really, where you can keep your eyes on the prize. And I was able to go there and say, you know, because I was feeling like, what am I going to say? You know, I'm not naive and so on, whatever. But then I realized, you know, what good would it do for me to get into an argument with the president of Venezuela? What was my objective here? My objective was to calm things down. And so I was able to kind of bite my tongue and just begin to, you know, listen to myself first, listen to see my own emotions and so on, and then be able then, because I had listened to myself, to listen to him instead. And I was listening to him, studying him, watching it as if it was kind of a movie, a play. And sure enough, after 30 minutes, I mean, this was a man who was known for making 8-hour speeches with no problem whatsoever. I'm sure if I'd gotten into an argument with him, we could have been there till dawn. But after 30 minutes of not responding and just listening and nodding my head, I saw, watching his body language, I saw his shoulders sink a little bit. And so he said to me in a kind of weary tone of voice, he said, "So, Yuri, what should I do?" Now, that is the faint sound of a human mind opening. You know, before that, anything, you know, we would have been off to the races. But that was like a slight opening. So I said, "Mr. President, it's December, it's almost Christmas. Last Christmas, because of the crisis in the country, all the festivities were canceled. The same could happen this year. why don't you have the whole country go to the balcony for a moment? Just give everyone, declare a truce, give everyone a chance to go spend Christmas with their families, holidays, and maybe in January we'll come back and maybe everybody will be in a better mood to listen to each other. He said, that's a great idea. I'm going to announce that in my next speech. His mood had completely shifted, and he said, yeah, in fact, over Christmas, I'd like you to come with me and actually travel the country so you can see the country for yourself. And he said, but wait a minute, you're a neutral, you're a mediator, maybe it wouldn't be so good for you to be seen in my company like that. And then he thought, but no problem, I'll give you a disguise. So what I learned from that story was that, maybe the greatest power we have as a mediator, as a negotiator in a situation like that, is the power of not reacting, is the power of being able to go to the balcony, being able to listen to ourselves first so that we can truly listen to others, so that then we can move things forward. So that inner work, to me, turns out to be absolutely essential, because as mediators, what do we have? We are our own kind of musical instrument. We're our own instrument. If we can tune our own instrument, then we can, maybe rise to the occasion in the difficult situations and sometimes we find ourselves. So that was the kind of the first lesson, was it wasn't just about listening to the others, it's about listening to yourself. It's not just about getting to yes with others, it's about getting to yes with yourself somehow. A second lesson I learned, because in mediation, my focus was on the parties and how do I, help the parties reach agreement, how the parties get to yes. But I remember in one of my very first stints as a mediator in this coal mine I was mentioning. It was a coal mine in Kentucky, and there were wildcat strikes. There were the company had taken the union to court, and the judge, in his infinite wisdom, the third time this happened, decided to jail the workforce for a night in order to, because they were breaking the contract. Emotions were extremely high. The national union was concerned that this situation might actually trigger a nationwide coal strike. At the time, they were packing guns. There were bomb threats. This thing had really gotten out of hand. And Steve Goldberg, my colleague at the time, we flew down there, and when we sat down with union leaders and management leaders, they would not even sit in the same room together. There was no way that they would talk with each other. And so we engaged in a kind of shuttle diplomacy back and forth for about 6 weeks, listening to each side, taking proposals back and forth. And finally, after 6 weeks, there was enough progress that they were willing actually to come and sit together. And so we had about 10 union officials and an equal number of management officials in a room for about 3 days. And then they were able to reach an agreement. And it was like the peace treaty, It was, they were practically, they were so astonished they were able to reach agreement, and they were celebrating, and it was amazing that they'd reached an agreement. And then there was one little detail, which was the agreement had to be ratified, of course, by the miners. And the following week there was a vote, and it was almost unanimous in rejecting the very agreement that their leaders had just painfully negotiated. And the reason wasn't that the agreement was much better than the agreement that they had, but there was so much distrust that the miners figured that anything that management had put their signature on, there must be a trick, and they decided to vote against it. And that left me with an undying appreciation for the importance not just of, trying to reach agreement among the parties, but the key other tables, which is the negotiation within the parties themselves, their internal negotiations. That I remember at the time there was a very well-known labor mediator, John Dunlop. We used to talk about there were these 3 tables. There's the main table, but then there's the 2, if there's 2 parties, then there are the 2 internal tables. And what I've found over the last 30 or 40 years is that often, very often, however difficult the negotiations are at the main table, it's nothing compared to how difficult the negotiations are with those two internal tables. And we need to learn to mediate those internal negotiations just as much as those external negotiations. That often, for example, you take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is kind of like the totem, the icon of difficult negotiations. Actually, the truth is, the Israelis and Palestinians can negotiate pretty well with each other. The problem is the Israelis can't negotiate with each other, and the Palestinians can't negotiate with each other. That's where often the real problems are. And I find that true time and time again. One of my sort of biggest areas of work for the last 6 years has been serving as a senior advisor to the president of Colombia, President Juan Manuel Santos, trying to see if there's a way to end it was a 52-year civil war in Colombia that's left hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions of refugees, and people had given up on it. And I would say over the last 6 years, again, same thing is true. However difficult it has been to negotiate with the FARC, the guerrilla group, it's been more difficult to actually negotiate inside the government. Those are the key negotiations that are difficult. Which is why, in a situation like that, what I've learned is that what I like to do when I go into a difficult negotiation like that one is actually work backwards, start from the end and work backwards. So that when I was first invited down there to Colombia 7 years ago, the first thing I did with the team, which was the president's elder brother and some of the negotiators, was I said, okay, let's imagine, at this time, almost no one would give any chance of success to this negotiation. There had been many attempts, they'd all failed. There was hardly anyone alive who could remember what it was like to live in peace in that country. And so I said, let's imagine for a moment that you're the chief of the guerrillas, who was a guy named Timochenko at the time. Actually, it was a guy named Alfonso Cano, because Alfonso Cano was later assassinated or killed. But I said, imagine you're the head of the guerrillas. How are you going to, let's imagine you reach agreement with the government finally on a peace agreement. How are you going to tell your men, your troops, your men and women actually, that after 50 years you're laying down their weapons? What are you going to say? How are you going to explain to them that they fought for 50 years, their comrades have all died? How are you going to explain that? In other words, I call it the victory speech experiment, which I think is a technique we can all use, which is to imagine what are the two victory speeches? What is each side going to say to their constituency? This is what we didn't do in the coal mine, is imagine the union leadership, how are they going to explain to the miners why they decided to accept an agreement with management? And so we began at that point, and I asked the president's elder brother, I said, okay, you're the guerrilla chief. Now, we're the guerrillas. Tell me why you agreed to lay down your weapons with this government that you don't trust at all, you've been fighting for 50 years, for half a century. And he struggled with that, but he tried to give that talk. And then from that talk, we then went to, okay, so what are the key irreducible interests that need to be met in order for the guerrillas to come to the table? And one was clear, was they couldn't surrender. There had to be a sense of honor. They had to be able to justify why so much bloodshed, so much sacrifice over 50 years. And they had originally fought the conflict over the issue of social justice. And so it was like, okay, so one thing we need to talk about is land and the distribution of land and the inequity of the distribution of land. So there was that. Then there was the issue of being able, of power, of political power, of being able to participate in the political game so that they could then advance their interests. So what could be done to bring them into the democratic political system, to give them sufficient voice in the society so that they could then pursue their interests non-violently rather than violently? And we went down, there was like 4 or 5 interests. And on that basis then, we kind of designed a kind of a formula of what would be an initial agenda. That agenda was then concretized. We went through 6 months of very, very highly secret negotiations because there were so many forces in the society that could have spoiled the negotiation. So there were a handful of people who knew about these very, very secret talks that were taking place in order to reach agreement on a formula on what was the essence, what was the agenda. Then the president announced that, and then they went through 5 years of negotiation, all unpacking that original formula that came out of that original victory speech, 300 pages of documents, but that's the agreement that they have now reached. And just a few months ago, something that was absolutely unimaginable was the guerrillas laid down their weapons and surrendered their weapons and are now entering into politics. It's a messy process, but it's quite amazing, and Santos actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for that this last year. So, and the process continues because there's a whole negotiation around implementation and so on, which could take 10 years, 20 years. How do you shift a society from war to peace? But again, the lesson is starting by imagining the internal negotiation within the parties. There's a third, if there's a third, one last lesson I would just mention, it's that, I imagined, originally in mediation that it's, it's about the moves, often that you make at the table, the things you say, the things you hear, the whole process that takes place at the table. And one thing I've learned over the last 30 or 40 years is that as important as those moves at the table are, you as a mediator, managing that process, the moves you make away from the table are possibly as important, if not more important, than the moves you make away at the table. It's the setup for the negotiation. It's the creation of a larger, what I call a third side, which is a larger container within which, involving lots of other parties who can then influence the parties about the importance of reaching agreement, that shapes the BATNAs, the alternatives of both sides. And if I can just go back to the Colombia example, as an example, it wasn't just about, okay, how do we negotiate, how does the government negotiate with the FARC, the guerrilla groups? It was about how do we set the larger table? Who can we get as allies, unlikely allies, as a third side? The third side isn't always neutrals, it's friends. It's the friends of the parties. It's those who have influence over the parties, those who have access to the parties. And to me, one of the real moves that really made for the success of this negotiation after so many failed negotiations was President Santos, a week into his presidency, reached out to President Hugo Chavez, Venezuela, his neighbor, where a lot of the guerrillas were taking refuge and sanctuary. Chavez had had a terrible relationship. The two countries were almost on the verge of war because actually Santos, when he was defense minister under the previous president, had ordered an attack on a guerrilla camp in Ecuador. And Ecuador and Venezuela said, this is a breach of our territorial sovereignty, and so, relations were ice cold. But he reached out to Chavez, who was a friend of the guerrillas, a friend of the FARC, and Chavez agreed it was time for another, the time for guerrilla warfare was over. And so he agreed to help persuade the FARC to come to the table. So reaching out to someone like that, the friend of your enemy, to actually constitute a kind of third side. And Chavez played an enormously important role because he was an important figure for the FARC. The second move the president did was he reached out to Fidel Castro and Raul Castro, to whom the guerrillas looked up. And in fact, he made the bold move, which was extremely unpopular in Colombia, to actually host the negotiations in Havana. So, in other words, he was creating, and then he reached out to the United States, for example, which was an important player. So he wove a kind of a community network, what I call third side. The third side of the conflict, those who are the friends, the onlookers, the neighbors, those who are concerned, who do actually have an interest in a more peaceful, stable solution, and build a coalition, a winning coalition for peace around, kind of surrounding the parties, that then allowed, it's kind of like a cauldron, because the negotiations, often broke down, turned violent. A war was going on at the same time. The FARC were trying to assassinate President Santos. He was assassinating their leaders. I mean, the whole thing could have gone out of control, but to have that community embrace around it, holding it, turned out to be key to sustaining the possibility of peace to the point where it could do that. And it wasn't just an external third side of neighbors, it was an internal third side of the communities within the society. So he reached out to the business community, to the military, to the media, and built a kind of a community support for this process that sustained it to the end. So to me, that is actually, I think of the third side as our most, as an anthropologist, I think of it as our birthright, really. It's the oldest form of mediation, really, of dealing with conflicts, which is, I've watched it in indigenous societies like the San Bushmen of the Kalahari or the Semai in Malaysia, is whenever there's a conflict, they don't just see it as a conflict between the parties, they see it as a collective responsibility of the community to try to contain it, so that, for example, among the Bushmen, as I observed, if emotions start to rise high within the group or between the groups, all the men have these poison arrows that they use for hunting that are absolutely fatal to human beings. So someone goes and hides the arrows out in the bush, and then all the people in the community, the women, the men, even the children, sit around in a circle and they talk and they listen. And it might go on for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, however long it takes, until the elders are able to articulate a kind of an emergent solution. And the solution isn't just a settlement of the dispute. There has to be some kind of reconciliation between the parties. And if tempers are too high, someone is invited to go visit a neighboring tribe and just, let things, cooling off period. They have a whole system. That's the third side. And that's the challenge that we face in today's world, which is how do we recreate those community-based mechanisms for mediating conflicts that can help us as individual mediators. But the community turns out to be central. Let me, if I may, just because it's mediation in the real world right now, just take the moment right now. As a mediator right now, I'm continuing to work in Colombia, from which I've just returned, because it turns out there's another guerrilla group too, a smaller one, called the ELN, that needs to be brought into the process, and we're trying to do that and using third-siders like the Pope, who's a very important third-sider in this world, and to try to bring them into a process as well. In fact, just arrived at the first ceasefire agreement between the government of Colombia and the ELN, the first ceasefire agreement in 54 years. The first agreement in 54 years. It's fragile, but it all was helped by the Pope coming to Colombia last month. So, but there's Venezuela, as you know, is on the tip of there's huge suffering going on in that country. It's on the tip of violence. It needs a lot of help. There's Syria, of course, that I'm also involved in, have been involved in for a while. But the conflict around the world that actually most concerns me right now is the conflict between this country and North Korea. Because it's an existential conflict. If you game out that conflict, as war gamers have done, if war starts, it could lead to millions of people dying, millions. We could lead to the explosion for the first time in since World War II of an atomic weapon. It could lead to, even in the worst of circumstances, it could lead to the United States and China getting into a conflict. So it could lead to really to the worst war since World War II. And it's interesting to me that I'm asking, so I ask those questions, I go back to those 3 lessons of, where's the balcony? How do we step back? Because we have, 2 leaders who are kind of engaged in like a prize fight where they're trash talking. And we're watching this almost in a way like we're sleepwalking, like they're fighting, but actually we're right in the middle. I mean, it's actually humanity is being held hostage by this fight. And as they play this game of nuclear chicken, the question is who's going to back down? So it's, to me, one of the most pressing mediation challenges for the planet right now is how do we figure out a way to kind of cool down the situation, to reduce the risk to the point where, I mean, the risk right now, I just read this morning the former director of the CIA, of intelligence, said, I don't know if the risk is, could be 25% or 20% of war, but it's unacceptably high. And I've heard, even higher estimates or lower estimates, but no one knows. But it's one of these situations where we need to figure this out. We need to be able to go to the balcony. Remember what's important here. Cool down. Human beings, we react, and as Ambrose Bierce once put it, when angry, you will make the best speech, or in this case, the best tweet you will ever regret. And we're not even aware of what's going on. It was interesting. So I called an experiment. I got worried about this about 6 months ago, and I'm not a North Korea expert. I've just been, following it as anyone, over the years. But around 6 months ago, I realized, wait a minute, North Korea is developing the ability to strike the United States. Los Angeles, actually, is one of the cities that they often mention. And that's been totally a red line, totally unacceptable for any American president, not even this particular one. But so that's going to happen in the next, experts said it would happen within the next year, 2 years, 4 years. It's actually happened a lot faster. It's going a lot faster in the last 6 months than anyone imagined. And I thought, that's like a slow-motion Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, it's like, what are we going to do? How are we going to find this? So I started working on it a little bit, just to try to see what I could find out, reaching out to people who I know were going back and forth to North Korea, Washington, and so on, trying to learn as much as I can, even reaching out for, like coming here to LA to meet with Dennis Rodman, for example, who turns out is the only human being, or the only American who actually has a personal friendship with the leader of North Korea, who also happens to have a kind of friendship with our president because he was twice on Apprentice on the show. And so, here we have, these 2 leaders, and there's this one thread who connects them, who is this unusual individual by the name of Dennis Rodman. So, we need to be open to anybody being a third-sider, a third party in these situations. And and what it requires is precisely thinking about the victory speeches of each side. How can we imagine President Trump and Kim Jong-un kind of emerging out of this somehow as winners? What could be done? What do we know about their psychology? What do we know about the people around them who could influence them? How can they come out as victors in the situation without bringing the world to war? And so really thinking that through. So it goes to those negotiations. And then the third side to me is enormously important, is how do we activate the third side, the larger community of nations and individuals and organizations, to kind of create an embrace around the situation to say, hey, let's stop. I remember back in the back when I was working on the nuclear issue in the early 80s, I was meeting with someone who just come from a meeting in Kansas of women who were farmers, you know, kind of farming, and they were talking about the nuclear issue back then. As you know, the risk was very high back then, or was perceived to be very high. And this woman said, after listening to the reality of the problem, she said, you know, it's time to tell the boys to put away their toys and come on in. And, you know, it's time to tell the boys to put away their toys and come on in. And I thought, you know, that is a third side voice right there. You know, it's kind of like the boys are playing with their toys here, which in this case are nuclear weapons. You know, it's time to come on, you know, just to put them away and come on in. And that, to me, is a message that needs to be sent today, because those toys are, you know, lethal to millions of people and even pose, in the worst circumstances, an existential threat to all of us. So that's the third side, and that's why it's so important. So let me just end for a moment by just saying, because I want to leave some time for some questions if we have a little time, is just to say, you know, having spent 40 years wandering around the planet, you know, with Einstein's question on my mind, is how can we, as humanity, develop the moral, the emotional, the social, the cultural genius to learn to live together in this world in which really, you know, from an anthropological point of view, we're in the time of the human family reunion. It's the first time, thanks to the communications revolution, that all the tribes on the planet, all 16,000 language groups, we're all in touch with each other. And like many family reunions, it's not all peace and light, you know. There's a lot of emotions and grievances and resentments and so on. And the question is, you know, how do we all learn to kind of get along with each other and deal with our differences? And what I'll say is that no matter what problems we have, you know, the great problems facing humanity, whether it's hunger or whether it's climate change or whether it's war, you know, there's not one of those problems that could not be solved by us learning to get to yes. I mean, they're all problems that come from human beings. They're all problems that will be solved by human beings. It's not a meteorite coming from outer space. And so that's why I feel this field of mediation is the central, is kind of like, has the key. If we, and I've watched it over the last 40 years develop from a rather small fledgling profession into a profession where you can get these many people on a Saturday morning in LA, you know, talking about it. I really think we're still in our infancy, but we have so much to contribute to the world, from the micro of dealing with family disputes or whatever it is to the macro of dealing with the human family disputes. And that's why in the end, I come back to hope. I really think there's enormous hope. There's enormous potential. I think we can do this. And I'm really gladdened and gratified to be here with a group such as yourselves, to be part of this movement that I think can make a signal contribution to humanity. Thank you very much.
So those of you who are out there who have taken my classes at either Cal State Northridge or Dominguez Hills or USC and saw in your required reading list getting to yes, now's your opportunity to actually understand why it's on the required reading list. So again, thank you so much for everything. One of the things Professor Urey did not mention is his ongoing work with former President Carter. We've mentioned it in part in the past, but as many of you know, the Carter Center exists today. It's one of the great waging peace centers in the world, really. And I understand you're working on a current project with President Carter. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Which one is that?
I thought you were working on something with the Carter Center at this point, or President Carter.
I am, but a number of projects. You have
I didn't have any of your existing work. We'd love to hear about it.
Well, yeah, no, it's been a real pleasure and privilege to work with President Carter for the last almost like 30 years, actually. 30 years, I guess. And to watch, I had the privilege, actually, being a big player in contributing ideas to the Camp David peace agreement back in '78, which he brokered so beautifully. But then I got to know him much better in the mid-'80s when we put together a group of kind of mediators around the planet we called the International Negotiation Network to work on different conflicts around the world. And ever since then, I've been in touch with him. And North Korea, for example, was a situation that he actually had a role in actually brokering a very important agreement with back in '94, that if that had been sustained, we wouldn't be in the position that we are in today. And even at the age of, I believe he's 95 now, as you saw, I mean, he doesn't stop. He offered to go to North Korea because he knew Kim Il-sung very well, the grandfather of the current leader. And I've also had the privilege of working with him most recently on the question of Syria, which is, one of the great tragedies unfolding on the planet. And but I think, were you talking about the Abraham Path? The Abraham Path, yeah. So there's one of my sort of love projects is a path in the Middle East. Like if you imagine the Pacific Coast Trail or the Appalachian Trail, or for those of you who know this wonderful pilgrimage path in Europe called Santiago de Compostela, is about just after 9/11, the Iraq War, and I was wondering, what could bring people together? What could remind us that no matter what divides us, and there's a lot that appears to divide us, that what unites us is far greater. And being an inveterate and walker, I decided, well, what about if we walk together? Maybe the Middle East conflict is tough, but what if we took a first step and went for a walk? And so and as an anthropologist and really appreciating the power of story, the idea came to me about what about reviving the ancient journey that Abraham and his family is believed to have taken 4,000 years ago in the Middle East. Because Abraham is kind of like the common thread, is the third side. And as I studied that story more, I got even more interested, because what Abraham stands for in all the different faiths is he stands for the value of loving kindness. That's what he's known for, is that he was known for his hospitality. He kept his tent open in all four directions to welcome strangers. And he's known for that more than anything. And people said, it's crazy. How are you going to have a walking path in the Middle East? I mean, no one's going to go there. How can you even cross those borders? There's wars going on. But the idea didn't go away, and I thought, what am I to do with walking paths? But so I started going over there and visiting some of these places that are remembered in the biblical tradition and the Quranic tradition as having been associated with this journey. And it turns out to be a thread that connects almost every country in the Middle East, going all the way from ancient Mesopotamia and Iraq on a big arc, all the way through Turkey and Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, where he's buried there in Hebron, in the city of Hebron, which actually is named after him, which Hebron, or in Arabic, Al-Khalil, means the friend. That's what he's known as the beloved friend. He stands for friendship and hospitality. And all the way to Egypt, and then finally, in the Islamic tradition, all the way to Mecca, where he's believed to have actually, that's why Mecca is Mecca. That's why the Hajj is because of this story. So I thought about reviving this ancient story, and people said this is crazy, but people said you could never do it. So about 10 years ago, I said, well, let's try. And so I gathered together a group of about 25 people from 10 different countries, including a rabbi, a priest, a minister, and an imam, just for good measure. And we went from one of the legendary birthplaces of Abraham, which is in northern Mesopotamia, just in Turkey, just north of the Syrian border, in Haran, where he hears these words, go find yourself, go find out who you are, which is really everyone's journey, is to find out who we are. This is kind of the mythical journey of, like Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, like, go find out who you are. And he set off on this journey, and we went all the way through, from there down to the city of Aleppo, which actually turned out to be named after Abraham because it means halab in Arabic, means milk. And Abraham is believed on his journey to have milked his goat to give it to the poor because he's associated with social justice. I mean, the amazing that there was a soup kitchen where they give soup to the poor and to the elderly in the name of Abraham, or as he's known in Arabic, Ibrahim. And all along the way, you find this thread that had kind of been buried, but it was kind of a reminder. And we ended up finally in Jerusalem and Hebron, where he's buried. So we went from womb to tomb, from birth cave to death cave, and showed it could be done. And as along the way, we listened to people and said, would you like to revive this ancient trail as a trail of pilgrimage and wandering? And the thing about the Middle East is everyone disagrees about everything, but they all agree on one thing, is they want tourists. They want people to come. And they're very hospitable, unbelievably hospitable for anyone who's ever been to the Middle East. The poorest person wants to invite you into their home, give you a cup of coffee, give you a meal. And so they were all excited about it. So we started and had little host committees in different countries. And these last 10 years have perhaps been the most difficult years in the Middle East in recent history to work in. But I'm happy to say that, just by persisting again and again, there is now over 1,000 miles of trail. There are thousands of people who are walking parts of the path. There are school children. I was just walking in the place where people would never have imagined a path was possible in the West Bank, for example. There's now a path from the very north of the West Bank to the south of the West Bank that is unbelievably waymarked. With the traditional red and white things you find on rocks and trees, which everyone said was absolutely impossible. How can you have a waymarked trail in the West Bank where every little inch is disputed by someone? But it's quite amazing, so much so that the World Bank has come in, and we were a little fledgling little NGO, and the World Bank said, well, this is very innovative, and we'd like to study this, and we'd like to support it, so the World Bank is now our partner in the West Bank. The French government, French communities. We've now helped our colleagues in Jordan map out a trail from the north of Jordan to the south of Jordan through unbelievable places like Petra, in the Sinai, from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai. And so it's just beginning, but because the one thing about a path is that however long conflicts last, paths last much longer. And it's just a place where you can walk, and I've noticed that when you have a different conversation when you walk because you're kind of shoulder to shoulder, facing a common direction. You're in the land, and Jimmy Carter actually, I invited him to walk once, and he came and walked in Syria actually before the war. So I invite you anytime if you'd like to look at our website, which is www.abrahampath.org, and you can find maps and guides and pictures and get a sense of it. And it's actually inspired, that's the other amazing thing, is it's inspired people to walk around the planet. They don't have to go to the Middle East. So that, for example, in the Brazilian city of São Paulo, which is the largest city in this hemisphere, every year for the last 7 years, they close down the streets of what's their Fifth Avenue, and they have a walk. And it walks from the Syrian sports club to the Lebanese sports club to the Jewish sports club. And last year they had 10,000 people walking, and they put up these huge, they have artists put up these huge blocks of the kind of the values of the path of tolerance and peace and love, you know, all, and that are up there, you know, decorated by artists, you know, that are like sometimes like half a block long. And it just inspires people to think that, hey, even with the most difficult conflicts, there are ways we can begin to come together, break bread, because that's the thing you do on the path, is you not only walk, but you stay in people's homes. It's homestays. And that's really quite amazing, to stay in someone's home and really get a sense of who they are and experience the hospitality that is associated with Abraham. So that's the Abraham.